Hello and welcome to a new episode of Data on the Rocks, the place where data aficionados round up, sometimes have a drink, and talk about data. I'm Florin Tufan, and in today's episode I sit down with Cal Inman. Cal is the founder and CEO of ClimateCheck. He's also a commercial real estate developer and a lecturer at UC Berkeley teaching masters in real estate development. Apparently that's a thing. Today I'll be talking to Cal about how it's like to run a data company focused on the climate, both a hot topic and a truly interesting and clearly important data niche. What was really interesting to me are the types of dilemmas that we see every day in our own data company. So I took the opportunity to ask Cal questions like, how do you deal with the imperfections of input data? And how do your clients understand scores? Things that I find both challenging and super interesting. I hope you enjoy. So Cal, great to have you here. What
Yeah,
is ClimateCheck?
uh, ClimateCheck is a company we started 3.5 years ago, and we are a data company that focuses on physical climate risk. Uh, so, simply, how are natural hazards that are changing due to the changing climate um, look into the future? So, we look at flood, fire, extreme heat, precipitation, drought, and routing in a new data set of high wind. So it's really just a geospatial data set that tells you specifically a property, an area. How is your risk profile changing into the future? And we look in 5 year increments, 60 years into the future. So that at a very high level, that's what climate check does.
Okay, and if you look at data as rows and columns, so the columns would be some scores associated with the fire, right? Some
Yeah,
hazard scores. And what's a row for you?
a row could be really however you want to search it, right? So it could be a latitude, longitude point, could be a parcel boundary, could be a boundary of a municipality, a state, it could be a neighborhood. Really, we allow folks to query kind of whatever they're interested in, and there's different insights from that. And then, yeah, in the column section, we have kind of a proprietary rating of what your risk is, but more importantly, uh, metrics to explain in a really easy to understand way what that risk is moving into the future.
No, very interesting. And how did you end up doing this? I know your background is in a completely different place, right? It's in commercial real estate, if I'm not mistaken. What does that have to do with tech and climate and analytics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, my background is commercial real estate, urban infill projects, real estate development, and I I think as an industry we're super interested in risk, right? Think if you look at anyone successful and an investor in real estate, a big part of what we do is risk mitigation, controlling risk, controlling your downside. Due diligence is a really important part of the process. So I think my mind was just there as a practitioner, and then you read about climate change, right? You read about it in the paper. I grew up in the Bay Area. We experienced a big wildfire that came through and burned a lot of the homes in the Oakland Hills. A lot of my friends, including my co-founder's home, burned down.
Oh,
And so I experienced this hazard, like we all do. In different regions, we have different hazards. So I think for all of us, it's top of mind. It's part of the news cycle. And then as a real estate practitioner, I really had no access to the data. The data existed, but there was no way I could look at my properties and say, what's my risk to fire in the future? Are these properties along the San Francisco Bay going to flood? And so I think the need as an end customer is kind of what started the company. So yeah, I'm in a totally different space now than I was 6 years ago.
right. So you'd suffer the consequences of everybody else having the access to that data. So you'd pay the insurance price for that basically baked in the fact that someone else knew what the risk for flooding was on your house,
Yeah,
or
I
it was
think
baked into the price of the property and so on, but you didn't know what. You didn't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, look, like who has access to the data and who doesn't, right? Bigger enterprise groups have been using climate risk data to inform their decision making for a long time, right? Like big limited partners, pension funds, they think about these risks, but the actual person deploying that capital on the ground at that point didn't really have access to this information. Um, yeah, and then insurance is a whole other piece, right? Like you insure your property, but you're insuring it for 1 year. You pay a premium and you get covered for 1 year. But we're seeing it here again in California. I have a property in Sonoma, which is north of San Francisco, where I live, and we've had a lot of wildfires kind of run through that county, and my insurance premiums have tripled because the risk, our understanding as an industry of the risk is much higher, but that premium is that's increase is carried on me, right? So I think it's important, even if we can insure something, to understand what the risk is moving into the future if we're going to hold some asset for a long time.
But is that um, like the difference in price for an insurance premium? Is it more of a price you have to pay because you know, or did the risk actually change? So the fact that there was a fire last year, if you go at a high enough level and you look at it as probabilistic, it shouldn't affect the risk of a fire catching up this year, right?
Yeah, that's a complex question. It gets above my pay grade. But I will say insurance industry uses something called catastrophic risk models, which is based on historical data. So if we look at two fires rolled through the town of Santa Rosa in the last 5 years, and as you get more of these historic events, then based on those historical models, the probability of fire will increase. Now, there's a lot of things to think about there, right? When a fire rolls through, the vegetation goes away. There should be some short period of time where maybe there's less fire risk, but then the vegetation grows back. Um, and rather than looking at it through the lens of historical uh, events only, we're looking at what are called global climate models. So how is the world changing with climate change? With the base kind of information we look at is heat and precipitation, and then we overlay a lot of other information. Look very far out into the future to understand kind of how the risk profile is changing, not in 1, 2 years, but in 5, 10, 25, 30, 40, 50 years.
And so, can you do that? Is it, well, a bunch of questions. Uh, how do you know if you're right when you look at risk at a period of 30 years, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the fundamental data we bring in, and anyone that's looking at climate risk, are these global climate models. So these are academically accepted and government data sets that we're bringing in. That being said, there are predictions, right? And as you know, I mean, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. The more you bring in, the further you look out. And so I think an important part of our job is communicating that uncertainty of that risk. Um, and so the uncertainty it comes from, right? We're using around 30 models. So there's uncertainty in the model spread. Then there's also uncertainty in the different, what we call mission scenarios, where it's like, what's the carbon output going to be as a global community? And how quickly is climate change going to advance? And there's a lot of factors in there too, but there's all these different emission scenarios. So it's like climate change is really bad quickly, or maybe we do a lot to mitigate climate change, and then maybe the risk profile is lower. So I think for us, it's important to communicate that range of uncertainty, because we can't say in 2050 your home's going to flood 27 centimeters. It's just like there's too much uncertainty to just give a specific number like that.
Yeah, I like to say that in this generation of data companies, we're here to do better but it's gonna be a long while until we're close to perfect. We're just adding incremental improvements, and then they
Totally.
will stack one on top of the other.
Hey, that's just it, right? Like we actually heard this when we started the company. We go to all these climatologists that have been studying this for 30 years, right? So it's their profession. They know this stuff. They're the ones producing the data. And I mean, we still hear it, right? It's like, oh, the data's not ready to give to the public. Like, we're not done yet with our job. And I get it from their perspective. It's right. They have this endless roadmap uh, to refine it, make it more accurate, communicate it better. Our view is, and I think most investors and homeowners, they want to know the information. So let's give folks the best data we have right now, and let's start making decisions around it. As we refine it and get better information, then it'll progress. But let's get it in the workflow now, because people want to know, right? They want to know if they're at a higher flood risk, in 50 years, in 20 years, in 10 years. And so I think giving them something after decades of work in this area, giving them something is reasonable.
Yeah, and then you might not know if this specific tree is gonna catch on fire or this specific square foot is gonna be flooded, but you might know if like there's a 60% probability that this village is gonna catch some fire in the next decade, and that might be good enough.
It is good enough, and there's really meaningful insights in there, and I think it can help make us aware of risks and probably most importantly, like you flag the risk and then you mitigate the risk, right? You create adaptation plans around, hey, we have some flood risk here. Yeah, in 20 years, we might have more granular flood risk, but at least we know there's flood risk on this property that's going to affect access, vehicular access to it. Let's do something in the physical world about it. And so I think that it's not like the data is like, some like voodoo thing. Like there's good data right now, and we can make good decisions about it. It's good actionable data, and it's pretty granular. Yes, it can be better to those climatologists that are working on it, but I think it's good enough, and folks deserve to see their work product too.
Yeah, so you come from the world of real estate. You obviously see and you're familiar with the applications there, where I imagine, uh, hopefully I'm gonna find out, but I imagine it affects the flow of money actually. Um,
Yeah,
I looking at the clients we work with and sort of the world we live in, I know it's a big application in insurance and sort of expanding around other financial services use cases that take that kind of data into consideration in a lot of decision making. Do you see other niches adopting this kind of data, which could be like surprising to an outsider?
yeah. I think it's pretty broad, the use cases, and we're trying to stay specific, and focus on real estate, right? Because the world I understand, I come from. And I think if you go too broad, um, the product is different, right? And the way you present the information is different. But look, really, who's affected by the physical climate risk? Anyone with a footprint. Uh, and so that could be, beyond real estate. It could be corporations, supply chain, right? It could be infrastructure, agriculture, and so it's the use cases are pretty broad because we're all affected by climate, and it could be loss of assets or loss of business revenues. Um, but what we've seen, like the adoption started with kind of commercial real estate. We're pushing very strong to the consumer, the homeowner, the home buyer, the home seller, and giving them the information. And so like those two things kind of are in alignment. But we're seeing a lot of increased interest amongst corporate and kind of the lending community as well. And a lot of that spurred by in the U.S. we have some kind of incoming government regulation requiring this climate risk disclosure. That may or may not go through, but at least it's making people aware of it and saying, "Hey, we should start looking at this and ingesting it." So, I mean, there's nothing like government regulation to kind of open up uh, a market of, uh, of something. So
So,
it's an interesting time. It's crazy.
so what would the regulation have you do? What is the proposed regulation?
SEC is proposing that there is proposing a climate uh, risk disclosure. So thinking of it as kind of a material risk, your risk to climate, and so that's carbon output, but it's also physical risk. What's your risk to these events happening in the future?
Got it. I loved what you said about the supply chain. I think we think about the disruptions in supply chain. We think about these major events like a war or the pandemic, or but if I plan to build 1,000 cars next month, and my supplier of doors is gonna have their warehouse flooded, that's as bad as a pandemic would be to me.
Totally. Like let's say, yeah, that door supplier, you only have one door supplier, and they only have one warehouse for a key part of that door, and that has some high flood risk, and some hurricane comes through, and there's some big surface flooding event that wipes out the warehouse. People can't get to work, and so that I think that's kind of what's beautiful as these all these data sets are built out. You start merging them together, and it gives you really impactful insights. Um, so I think that I've been excited about our conversations around that, and I think the evolution, people ingesting all these different things, there's going to be a lot of power to bringing them all together.
Yeah, I see with your example in supply chain, I see a lot of potential areas where the benefit only comes from combining different types of data, and you cannot get enough answers from one type of data.
Right, like you all bring in all sorts of different pieces of data, right, to give an insight. And I think your stuff will evolve too, and there will be more and more factors brought in to get deeper and more accurate insights.
Yeah, absolutely. And is the how what seems really interesting to me. So I like to think of data companies into sort of two worlds. They're cartographers, the documenters. I'm just trying to I see this tree there, and I'm just trying to be very accurate about saying that there's a tree there, and then update the map to reflect that there isn't a tree there when that disappears. And then there are sort of like the predictors of future, which I think ClimateCheck falls under that category, where you're whatever the mean. So sometimes it might be a score, or sometimes might be like a calculated value that has a lot of input data, but it is a form of predicting the future. And I always wonder. So predicting the future is like a moving target, right? You have historical data, and a lot of the data analysis you do, it has to be based on the past because it's the only thing you know for certain, or at least you can, for some with some sort of certainty. And what seems to me much more difficult in climate data is something that's actually very specific, because one thing that has changed a lot is the weather, which I assume is one of the major inputs.
Yeah,
So how does one make predictions in that changing environment? How do you deal with that?
yeah. I mean, weather's interesting, right? Because weather's a very short-term forecast, and we look at ranges of years for these major events. So it's like flooding, for instance. You get some surface flooding, or it's called pluvial flooding. So a lot of rainfall comes down, and the water accumulates because there's poor porosity in the soil, or it's hardscaped, or whatever, and the water pools up, and that creates kind of these localized floods. We'll look at a big window of time that could happen, and then using these global climate models, like when are we going to see this really heavy rainfall that will cause that, and looking at the intensity, duration, and frequency of that water coming out of the sky, and then modeling it onto the topography of right now the U.S. and we're working on Canada with the soil porosity, with the flood defenses in place, all of that. And so I think kind of in your like two worlds of data, we're doing a bit of both, right? But I think really important part of our job, and for both of those folks, is making that data easy to ingest, easy to understand, easy to access. Because this stuff can get so complex and the data sets are so huge. How do you actually use it in a meaningful way? And that's really our focus. I mean, we do some synthesis of the data, some modeling, but really it's about aggregation and creating real meaningful insights from all of these different data sets.
Yeah, you see this fallacy a lot with the old world of data, where it's really gated. You have to jump through hoops to get your some sort of access, but then the access has like it's really limited to specific use cases and specific forms, and you never get to see it. You have to more or less trust them on it, and then when you've started using it, it's too late, right? You don't have
Yeah,
a like an easy way to ingest data from 10 vendors that are more than 5 years old, and to be able to compare and make averages. And
yeah. I mean, you know a lot more about the data world than me, and maybe our approach just comes from not being inside the data world. But we pride ourselves in complete transparency of what data we bring in, how we synthesize it. It's all open book. We give you the recipe. You know, you can bake the cake on your own if you want. It's not an easy cake to bake, but you could do it. But I think more and more we're seeing customers want to see like what is in it, and they want to see it up front before they ingest the data. And so I think transparency is a really kind of important part of what we do. And then technologies makes transferring data easily. We've transferred some data to you all, and we give you an API or match and append, you know, a million records. And I think the tech stack's a lot different now too.
yeah, and then you have lots of platforms like Snowflake or Databricks. They make it extremely easy for you to communicate with other data vendors or data holders. Do you um so in one thing that I to me your what climate check is doing is fascinating, because I it the way I look at it, it has a lot of dependencies. I don't know what goes into the cake. I'm gonna ask you in a second, because I'm really curious. I do have some hypotheses. I have no idea if they're true or not. I've seen the cake. I've tasted the cake. Um,
How's it taste?
but it was okay, you know. No, no, I was super impressed. So I because I knew you were sort of our age of a company, and you always have low expectations from a startup, and I was extremely impressed, like blown away.
Yeah, but it could be a little fluffier, a little too much sugar.
No, no, it was. So I think what you achieved, and I think you have like a sort of unique advantage, not coming from the tech world, but coming and looking at it as a client, and now you understand the tech world, but you still look at it as a client. And I think what you managed to do is actually really hard for an insight company, which is making available a lot of data, so a lot of attributes that mean different things, but that are shaped in a form that's almost self-explanatory,
Yeah, yeah,
and that I believe is hard to achieve.
yeah. I think that is hard. You know, I think we got really lucky as a company. Our first hire is this super wicked smart woman that got her PhD in data communication and visualization, right? So she just focused on how do we communicate, and she was working on air quality for the consumer. So air quality is complex, and there's all these shit particles floating in the air, and we breathe it in, and they're probably bad for us in different ways. I don't know anything about it, but I look. We have wildfires here in California, so I look. Everyone looks at the air quality kind of maps, and there's all this ways of presenting it. And I think they are really far ahead in presenting kind of complex scientific ideas in a really, again, easy to understand way with maps and colors and how do we look at a spectrum of color and understand it, and what's intuitive for a consumer or someone that doesn't understand statistics or doesn't understand health or public health. How can we communicate that in a number and a color, and make people, and then help people make decisions around it? Okay, stay inside today. It's like pretty smoky outside. It's extremely risky. Well, it might not feel risky. So I think having her as part of our team was key to figuring out how to not manipulate, but present the data in a way that anyone can understand. And then you have me on the other end of the table saying, I'm a dumb real estate developer. Like, make it simpler, make it simpler, make it simpler. So it's 20 iterations of like, I don't get it. I don't get it. And everyone just being honest with each other. And look, it's a work in progress. We've gone through, and then you start getting customers and they say, I don't quite get this. And then you explain it to them, and we can tweak the product, tweak how we're presenting it, add in more fields for more insights. And so, yeah, it's still a work in progress.
So what goes in the cake, right? What the cake is like a number of scores that predict the hurricane risk, the fire risk, how bad is it gonna be in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term, as an aggregate score. What goes into it?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we'll start with kind of what comes out of it. Like, what are you eating? We get, yeah, each of those different hazards. We look at um, geography, so like space, right? So we're looking at a parcel boundary, a 3 acre industrial parcel. And so that's really important, is we're looking at that on a map. And then we're looking at these risk factors in 5 year increments into the future. And then for each kind of segment of time, we give information about risk. And that risk information is, what's the probability of an event happening? What's the frequency of it? What's the intensity of it? So what's the probability that you're going to experience a flood, and what's the depth of that flood? Uh, what is the frequency of a hot day today? What is that hot day? How hot is it? What's the intensity of it? And then how often will that hot day happen in the future? And how hot is it going to be then? So I think all the hazards are kind of the same, right? We're trying to give this core base metrics moving into the future based on this kind of geographic search. And then what goes into it is different for each hazard. Again, the core kind of fundamentals, the flower of the cake is, maybe we're going too deep on this analogy, is these global climate models. Like, how is the world changing into the future from a climate perspective? And that fundamentally is heat and precipitation. And then from those kind of, that base, that foundation, you can add in a lot of other layers to understand wildfire. We're looking at vegetation, historic burns, um, and then from the heat and the precipitation, you can start understanding things like fire weather days, when you get those hot winds when fires occur. So just things like that. So we start layering it all in, and we get insights on different levels of granularity for each hazard. Some are very coarse, like 4 kilometers, and then some become very granular, like flood, right? We have very granular uh, elevation maps. We understand what the topography is on a 10-meter grid across the United States, for instance. So we can give some kind of deeper insights there. I think that's another key piece, is like letting folks know what you can do and what you can't do. Like, what are the limitations? Because I also find there's, just seeing what's out there's a lot of over promising. To our point, the point we were talking about earlier, like uncertainty. There's a lot of over promising. But yeah, that's kind of what it is, how we make it. And I make it sound easy. There's a lot of smart people working on this every day.
No, I bet. And actually, to me, it sounds really complicated. Well,
Yeah,
any sort of data that's hard to test or come up with a testing methodology, and then it takes you a couple of years to know if you're right or wrong.
yeah,
It almost doesn't matter how simple the recipe is, because it's a tough process.
totally. Back testing, and then making sure people understand it. Again, like the focus, everyone's focused on making it easy to understand, easy to ingest. Because the global climate models, all this data we're taking in is good, really good government and academic data, but it's just a lot of it. And what do you parse out? What's insightful?
And is that you might not be able to give a too thorough of an answer, but is the government climate data as thorough as you'd expect it to be or as you'd need it to be?
I mean, what we're getting like from government organizations, things like elevation maps, right? This stuff's pretty good, and it's country by country, right? Here in the U.S., there's really good data, and but there's always holes, right? Like there's good flood data in the U.S. compared to other countries. We complain about it here, but we have FEMA flood maps. There's a lot of gaps geographically. There's a lot of gaps. I think the biggest gaps are in how they're presenting it because people don't quite understand what it means. Um, and But I think a lot of it's good data. I think it's just presented kind of in a like old school way.
Right, they don't translate it.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I need to.
you
Yeah.
mentioned, sorry.
Oh, let's go ahead. What's that?
Yeah, no, you mentioned gaps in the data, and that's inevitable, I think. And it's better to have gaps in the data than sort of give an opinion or like for 90% of California you get data from a month ago and then there's this small piece of land here from which we only have data from a decade ago and we won't tell you. So it's better to have gap than get something that's unpredictable. But I was wondering, with the gaps which are completely inevitable, do you generate synthetic data? So do you sort of try to estimate what the gap could be?
Yeah, I think where there are holes that we can fill, we do, and then I think we're also again completely transparent about what we don't have. And I think one thing we get asked for all the time is, give me the financial impact of this event on a particular property. And I think if you're looking at one specific property, there's no amount of data that's available, right? The best satellite imagery, the best lidar data is not going to tell you in your roof vents, do you have 1 inch screen on there or an eighth of an inch screen? Is it going to protect an ember from flying into the roof? Um, do we know? We know some information from permit history, but there's not enough to give a really insightful answer within a range of certainty that we would feel comfortable giving that information on. Now, on larger portfolios of properties, there's a lot of insights you can make. And so I think, I think it's about being honest about what's possible and what's not possible. Not that we're not working on it, uh, but what's possible today.
So do you do see it possible at some point in the future where you're able to say, well, maybe not like specific, okay, this is gonna cost you $50,000, but like for this property, it's if we aggregate all the risk for the next 50 years, it's gonna probably at some point be 10% damaged.
Yeah, I think you could get like damage ratios and things like that, and eventually you can convert that over into some financial numbers. But I think I think you don't want to overpromise and with the data and be misleading. I think that could be really hazardous for folks. You don't want like false positives, right? And you don't want to say that there isn't a risk where there is a risk also.
And how do you deal with i- setting the right expectations, right? Because you don't want to say like, okay, this is okay. It says 75 here, but we actually nobody knows. So, and that's obviously not true, right? There are different degrees of certainty, but then you also like even 1 year is a long time, a decade. Do you how do you mitigate the expectations of the client when you could have like a very bad summer upcoming and just be really unlucky, and then the client could maybe say, yeah, no, it was your data. So how do you align, because we understand exactly what that means and what sort of probabilities are and what luck is, and but do the clients understand?
I think they do. I mean, we're pretty clear. We're looking very far into the future, and we're talking about what the probability of something happening is over a long period of time. And folks know, and I think it's also in how you communicate it. Like, does anywhere have a zero fire risk? Like, no. So I think it's how you communicate the information, um, and how you present it. But I think people coming to us understand that what climate risk data is, and they want these very forward-looking projections into the future. The other thing is we update. Every month we have big updates because climate change isn't necessarily a fast. It's not very nimble. It's not volatile like a price index or something like this. But our understanding of the science is evolving, and so that's our job, right? We talk to all the folks that are in each of these fields and understand what the newest best thinking is around this stuff. And we get new information around fire. We're just doing a big fire update right now with new metrics based on kind of the current understanding of climate change and fire risk. And so I think we're saying here's a big improved data set with more metrics, different metrics, and we're looking at it in a different way now that's more accurate. I'd say the other thing that's important in data is feedback. So because we go to the consumer, we put out 20 million plus API calls a day to consumers who intimately understand their location, right? They live in Florida, they live in Seattle, Washington, wherever, these different geographies, these different hazards. And over the last few years, we get feedback, right? Like, hey, this doesn't seem right, or this isn't my understanding of the risk in this location that I've lived in for 30 years. I'm intimately familiar with what's going on here. I live up on a hill, and like, how could you have a flood risk? Um, and so I think that always allows us to refine the data, right? We're getting all this feedback back in to the system, and that helps us present the data. A lot of times, maybe like, hey, we feel the data is still right after a deep dive into their one little property. But I think if it's misleading to them or it doesn't feel intuitive to them, that's on us. We're not presenting it correctly. So it allows us to your question about are people do they feel misled by the data? I think a lot of it's in the presentation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's to me, it's still a tricky area to navigate, right? Because it's setting expectations is so much of it. But it seems, or what I'm getting is that most of the clients or most of the users also have that expectation of we just want better. We want
Yeah,
something. We want something that's we want what you have.
we want
We're
cake.
not.
No
Yeah,
one's
we
giving
want
us
cake.
cake.
We don't expect the perfect cake. We understand that everybody's iterating on the recipes, and we're all trying to figure it out.
Could you imagine that first human that tried cake? They're like, "This is amazing." But if we tried that cake, we're probably like, "That tastes like shit." Uh,
Yeah,
but they were stoked on the first slice of cake. It was better than no cake.
yeah, absolutely. Do you have? So I'm thinking. Well, I have a bit of insight. So I live in Romania, right? And we had a period of time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when there was a lot of flooding. I don't know. There was a few bad years, and then incompetent authorities. And one thing that was really interesting, so in the areas with higher risk of or higher historical risk of flooding, people just knew, and it wasn't the authorities, it was people just knew that you have to build your house at a higher level. Like your door doesn't have to, it has to not be at the ground level, it has to be a bit higher because you never know, like sometimes it rains really badly. And then in other areas they were caught completely by surprise, and even though like the weather wasn't as bad, the impact was significantly higher. Do you see, like, I will put the umbrella term of like cultural difference on this. Do you see that kind, and do you see that kind of differences, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think we're pretty agnostic of like what the housing type is, who the user is, or housing type, what the property type, asset classes, industrial, whatever. And we're really trying to just communicate base hazards. But I think what you're talking about is really interesting. I mean, the vast majority of humans live in floodplains, like historically, because that's where we get water, right? There's access to water is really important. And then trade, you start thinking about ports where all these cities were built up. So humans love water. I mean, most animals love water. With that comes risk, I mean, we see that with all the hazards, right? Like, yeah, it's really nice to live in California on the coast in the redwood trees, but with that comes some risk. So we've also lived in these places for a long time, so I think people are familiar with the risks, right? They've experienced them. But I think with climate change, what we're trying to communicate is like, how are those risks changing in frequency and intensity? So when we present someone with a flood risk, we don't get a lot of emails like, I don't have a flood risk. It's like they know that when they live on like that very edge of the beach in Florida, when those king tides come in and a big swell, that they get some water on their property. They're not, no one's blown away by it. We're not getting a bunch of emails from those folks being like, this doesn't seem right. But what we do try to do is put rails around and quantify, okay, it's happening this much today. It's going to happen this much in the future. And it's going to be a little deeper. And so it's not really shocking to anyone. But that being said, like human nature also is like, I mean, particularly here in the United States, right? Like immigrant country has been developed really quickly. Our money moves quickly, and we think a little shorter term. So we look at development patterns here. We've done some great studies overlaying other people's data. New construction development patterns. Where are we developing? Well, we're developing right into the wildlife urban interface where there's extreme fire risk. But why? Because that's the land that's available for the housing type that we like to build here, which is single family homes. So I think the short term thinking of kind of our economy is can introduce some higher risk in some of these natural hazards. Anyway, that's kind of more of a we're getting pretty philosophical here, but I think it's
No,
interesting.
actually, this is fascinating to me. So the scores you're presenting are more, or at least, or the expectation on the other side is that they're relative. So in other words, there are means to measure how bad does it get in the next 5 years compared to the past 5 years, as opposed to uh, absolute
Yeah,
values.
yeah, exactly. We're looking. You have to look at current risk and then future risk, and then you get some rate of change in there. And but you have to have a baseline. And so even some of our hazards, like heat, for instance, my hot day here in San Francisco, we were talking about this before the recording, is much different than a hot day where you're sitting, right?
Yeah.
And uh, and so my personal, like, how I've adapted physically to dealing with heat is different than yours, but also my infrastructure is different from hot and cold than yours is. I have single pane windows in an old Victorian home here. We have the same curtains for people listening to. If you're
But we're
watching,
not in the same house.
we're on the other side of the world. But yeah, so I think I think that's really important to kind of look at local baselines, because that's how people perceive risk too. So I think you have to start with what is it today, and then what is it in the future, and communicating both those things. So our ratings are relative, so we can say this home is different than this home, and those are relative ratings. But each rating is compiled of like current risk and also future risk.
Yeah, so like a 64 risk of drought in Texas is very different from a 64 drought risk in New York.
Yeah, yeah, or it could be similar, it could be different, but we take a different metrics in. Yeah, if you have one place is a current risk today, but it's not growing drastically over time, but another place is a very low risk today, but it's growing drastically. Like that's all factored into that one rating.
Yeah, I think that that helps a lot uh, for people to understand it, because you don't need to have a lot of like pre-existing knowledge other than your life experience if you've been there for a while.
Yeah, totally. And like whether you're an investor or whatever, I mean, we all understand kind of natural hazards. We read about them, we experience them. So the stuff we're talking about isn't it's not total rocket science, people. I mean, at least the way we're presenting it.
Yeah. Did you have so one big problem that we have, or one big challenge, not necessarily a problem anymore, is with what we call taxonomies, or in some cases nomenclatures. Like what do you call what? um, and I was wondering, is there like a debate to what a flood is, or is it clear to everyone that above a number of inches it's a flood and below a number of inches it's just a bad rainy day?
I
Do
mean,
you
it's something we're always dealing with. So a lot of these events that we experience, like a hurricane, is is multiple different kind of hazards, right? If you think about a hurricane, you have high wind that causes like the majority of loss when it hits. You also have a big storm surge, like water coming in. Uh, but you also sometimes lower probability, but can be extremely devastating, like what happened to Houston, which is you get big surface flooding events. So we get folks asking, like, "Hey, can you just give us a risk of a hurricane?" It's like we try to keep everything simple, easy to understand, and part of simple is keeping them disaggregated. Because once you start saying we're aggregating these things, how do you weight them? And it's different by asset class. It's different by event. How do you weight a low probability but a super devastating thing like the surface flooding from a wind event that's higher probability, maybe cause less damage? Um, and so I think keeping them separate, and even within flood, we have four different types of floods. We break it out. We say here's storm surge, here's sea level rise with a high tide element. Here's inland flooding, which composes of surface flooding, but also river flooding. And I think breaking out is really important. But I think the words you use are important. We're always fixing them, evolving, and just making them again easy to understand. I'm saying that a lot, but it's really what we're focused on.
No, it was actually one of the main things that I loved when I first saw your data. I love the fact that you break it down so granular into factors, because it's not the kind of problem that I spend a lot of time thinking. But once I saw that, I realized, yeah, okay, a place that gets some bad rains 20 times a year, but it's never horrible, versus a place that gets once a decade, like it gets completely demolished. You need to put that kind of control in the hands of, or in the minds of your client. It makes
Totally,
a lot
yeah,
more sense.
totally. Yeah, you could have the same annual rainfall, but if it's coming in, the vents are bigger. They need different gutter sizes. I mean, the solutions are that simple, right? How big's your
Yeah,
downspout? Um,
yeah, it
so
matters a lot if all the rain falls in one day versus spread across the year.
totally, yeah.
Yeah, and so I want to end up with a question that is not sort of business, and it could be like a lot of it could be just your assessment, your educated guess. How bad is the climate situation? Are we right to panic?
That's a deep existential question. I think you see both sides, right? I think, well, one, it's politicized, but taking that away, I think you see the same thing you saw with COVID, right? You see some people have different thresholds for risk, and you see some folks way underestimating the impacts of climate change, right? They're like, you know, let's close our eyes, let's not worry about it. This is like this is something so far out in the future. Let's worry about tomorrow. Let's worry about geopolitical conditions. Let's worry about inflation. Let's worry about the cost of natural gas and petroleum. Like, let's feed our kids today, whatever. And so they underestimate the risks. And these are risks that we need to really create adaptation strategies for today. And there are communities that are going to be hurt by this if they don't do that. Um, the other side of it is there's a lot of people that are yelling and screaming, climate change is going to end the world. And we get emails from people like, where do I move? This is happening in the future. We have plenty of time to adapt. And there's a lot of like over the too much fear. And so I think both of those kind of extremes, right? Just like we saw during the pandemic, if there's a lack of data, people and there's not transparency about what's actually happening and what the scientific community's understanding of this is. Uh, I think it can. There's a lot of hazard on both sides. So really, our goal is not to be a fear monger. The world's ending, or like, hey, it's all just going to be fine. But really, like, what's the all the different scenarios that can happen, and then communicate that to people so they can make informed decisions. Because right now, I think there's a lot of kind of uninformed decision making going on. So no,
Yeah,
that
and
was a very unclear answer to your question.
no, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's actually I love that you didn't give like a short definitive answer, but made it more nuanced, and I love the parallel with the pandemic actually, because we saw that at a global scale. Like there were people that said we don't have a problem, and then like you cannot agree with that. Like we definitely have some problems, and I don't want my parents to get sick, and
Yeah,
so you cannot say that we don't have a problem, and then on the other end of the spectrum, like no, 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 lock yourself in the house, wear 5 masks, like it's really bad. And it's hard to agree with that as well. But and what we saw was really missing, like no, no, give us more raw information, stop chewing our food, stop giving us the definitive conclusion, and let us at least form an opinion. We'll follow the laws as we do all the time or most of the time, but then tell us why, like explain why you think the things are the way they are, and basically give us access to data. It doesn't have to be all the data, it doesn't have to be perfect data, but tell us what you know, so we can at least have an opinion on things. And I think what you basically described the same thing with the climate. Like what's more important is to have access to enough raw data so that you can have multiple entities forming different opinions, and then maybe we have a shot at understanding what we're going through.
yeah. And look, in this world of climate, it's different than that. Public health, because that is a new problem. Everyone's trying to figure it out, working fast. This, like, we've been working on it a long time, and there's a lot of good insights and just better data.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cal. This was fascinating to me. I hope our listeners enjoy it at least half as much as I did. I didn't know much about the topic until I met you, and I definitely not know a lot of things before this conversation. But thank you so much. This was extremely interesting to me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I like talking to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Cal.